Do you need everybody to mute their mics first, Sarah?
Yeah, or just be silent.
Sarah, is that a go?
Almost. I'm just waiting for it to catch up. All right, it's all set.
Well, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. This is the East Bay Regional Park District Board Natural and Cultural Resources Committee meeting on September 8th, 2021. And I'll ask Sabrina to do a roll call of the committee, please.
Okay, thank you. Committee Chair Coffey, Director Lane.
Here.
Director Wieskamp. I'm sorry, Director Waspy.
Here.
And Committee Chair Coffey.
Here.
And then the rest, Assistant General Manager Kelchner.
Here.
Cultural Services Coordinator Anna Marie.
Here.
Chief of Stewardship Matt Grau.
Here. Here.
Deputy General Manager Ana Alvarez.
Present.
Chief of Planning Brian Holt.
I'm here.
And the Chief of Design and Construction Lisa Gorgon. Well, that concludes all of the staff members there were other staff that have not mentioned that are here today, but that is, I have completed the roll call. Thank you.
All right, Sabrina, thank you much. I have finally, I think I've gotten this disclaimer down, so I'll proceed with it. Today's board committee meeting is being held in accordance with Governor Newsom's executive order allowing for board members to participate in standing committees remotely via Zoom or other vehicles. I understand it's set to the executive order is set to expire at the end of this month, but is likely to be replaced with some sort of hybrid arrangement for future public agency meetings. We are also providing live audio and video streaming via YouTube and this Zoom, and have provided the public the opportunity to email or call in prior to the meeting for public comment. All information regarding participation in this meeting can be found on our agenda on the district website at ebparks.org. After each presentation this afternoon, we will be taking public comment through the Zoom platform on the two items on our agenda. So do my colleagues have any questions about the meeting or these procedures? We're all pretty well used to them at this point. So we'll begin our agenda. We've done the roll call. Item 2 is Rekindling Fire, a presentation with guest speaker, Professor Don Hankins, introduced by Cultural Services Coordinator Anna Marie Guerrero. Hi, Anna Marie.
Hi, thank you so much. So good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Anna Marie Leon Guerrero, and I am the Cultural Services Coordinator for the East Bay Regional Park District. And today it is my absolute honor to introduce Professor Don Hankins to all of you this afternoon for his talk titled Rekindling Fire. So Professor Hankins is a Plains Miwok fire expert and professor of geography and planning at the California State University at Chico. He has a BS in wildlife, fish, and conservation biology, and a PhD in geography from UC Davis. Of course, many of our Parks District staff are familiar with Dr. Hankins and his work, as he has consulted with the Park District over the years on a number of different projects. So today, Dr. Hankins will be talking about the possibility of restoring Indigenous fire to the East Bay Regional Park District landscape, how it can improve and maintain environmental health, facilitate cultural revitalization efforts, and how the implementation of Indigenous burning practices can reframe our relationship with fire. So in closing, I want to acknowledge, as President DiRosario did yesterday at the Board of Directors meeting, that the East Bay Regional Park District's headquarters is located within Huichun territory on the unceded lands of the Ohlone Chochenyo-speaking peoples who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. Today, I'm talking to you from Ardenwood Historic Farm, which is located within the Ohlone Chochenyo-speaking tribal territory of the Tuibon. The lands now encompassed within the boundaries of the East Bay Regional Park District are homeland to a diverse and resilient group of Indigenous people who are descended from Ohlone, Bay Miwok, and Delta Yokut ancestral tribes. These lands are also held sacred and stewarded by neighboring tribal groups throughout the San Francisco Bay Delta and San Joaquin Valley. The descendants of all of these Indigenous groups are thriving, vital members of the greater Bay Area community. They remain intrinsically connected to the land they have stewarded since time immemorial. So please join me in paying respect to the ancestors and descendants of these tribal communities and to the land itself. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Don Hankins. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, and I apologize. I'm not going to run my video for the group just because I'm on a satellite connection, and the satellite connection is kind of poor with the video going, we learned earlier. So I am going to share screen with you all and start my presentation through that. And one moment, and we should be up and running on that. So for the directors, I can see your faces. Can you see the screen that I'm sharing right now? Perfect, thank you. So thank you, Anna Marie, for that introduction. And as Anna Marie suggested, I have had the great pleasure of working with East Bay Regional Parks throughout my career, beginning as a fish and wildlife biologist with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and also, in my work at CSU Chico. And as a cultural practitioner, having connections to sites within the East Bay and within East Bay Regional Parks land, it's really always been on the back of my mind and forefront, really, of how we can work together to bring fire back into this landscape. And over the last year, we've had some really great conversations with some of the staff, in particular, around how we could think about putting fire back into the landscape. And Anna Marie had asked if I would give a talk for you all about that. So I'll share some of my insights from both the cultural side and also the professional side of the work that I do. To begin with, I think it's important for us to understand story and connection to this place. And for a lot of the lands within the East Bay Regional Parks, they fall within the storyscape, if you will, for myself as a Miwok person, but also many of the other tribes, as Anna Marie had mentioned in her welcome. And in those stories, we have a knowledge of fire. And in the beginning of our stories, we have stories that tell us about devastating fires that burned across the landscape. But from those fires, then we learned how to steward fire within the landscape. And so a healthy relationship with fire within the landscape is good not only for the cultures, but also for the wildlife and other species that live within that landscape. Many years ago, one of my elders had shared with me some knowledge of information that was shared with her by one of her elders going back to the early 1900s. And that information really plays out, I think, in the context of the world we're experiencing today. And that is that if people stop burning, wildfires will become rampant. And with nearly 2 million acres ablaze in California as we speak, there obviously is a time when we have to realize that we're never going to get ahead of the situation until we start to put fire back in the landscape. So to understand the context of cultural burning and what Indigenous burning brings to the landscape and brings to culture, it's a very complex thing. It's about a whole variety of different things. And there were studies that were done back in the 1970s by Henry Lewis, an anthropologist, who identified over 73 reasons why California Indians use fire. And I'll just summarize some of those, which include maintenance of travel corridors, game management, conservation and protection of areas that are fire sensitive, water stewardship, cleaning up the landscape, and production of food, medicine, and fiber plants. And all these things, if we think about that stewardship that people stewarded within the landscape, it created a very rich landscape, one of the most biologically diverse landscapes in the world, and it was enhanced by fire. And there was a strong connection between people using fire and the outcomes that it generated. So when we think about that idea that California in its geologic history and the evolution of biota and the cultures of this place, those cultures shape the landscape with fire, shape the vegetation communities with fire. And I think this illustration using the photographs of Yosemite Valley really give a nice background for that, a good visual for what that looks like. So if we go to 1866 on the left side, we see Yosemite Valley in a time period shortly after European arrival. And so what we're seeing in this photo is Yosemite Valley with the meadow of the Merced River being dominated by grasses and oaks, and it was frequently maintained by fire. The Miwok and Paiute peoples of this region use fire almost on an annual basis to steward for the outcomes of what we see in that photo. But following European settlement within the region and going forward, the next 100+ years, we see that landscape changed quite dramatically, that fire was excluded from the landscape and conifers began to encroach into Yosemite Valley. That has ramifications for the way that fire behaves within the landscape. It puts that system at risk for devastating impacts of fire, changes the way that water interacts within that landscape, and the list goes on and on. So when we think about wildfire considerations and impacts, there's a lot for us to be thinking about. For me, as a cultural practitioner and somebody who studies fire, I think about the cultural side of it in these ways, that wildfires impact our sacred sites in multiple ways, from the actual suppression of fire and the equipment that's used to suppress fires, to simply changing what's familiar about those landscapes, the vegetation communities that are linked to that sacred geography, as an example. We lose access to gathering sites. We lose plants, wildlife, and the diversity that we try to maintain. And a lot of times the wildfires are actually, particularly in the lower elevations, creating a cycle where the fire is actually feeding invasive species within the landscape. And thinking about the next presentation on Spartina, obviously that's not within a lot of these areas in the uplands that I'm talking about, but that kind of cycle of invasive plants can be really devastating to the ecology of place. And then there's also the side of that environmental change that is, perpetuating the kind of grief that culturally we've had to deal with through historical traumas. And the environmental grief side of it is really a piece of that. And that's what I'm meaning by solastalgia, is that environmental grief, where things change from what's familiar to something that we can't even recognize anymore. So Indigenous fire is unique in that, many of us are very familiar with the idea of prescribed burning, and prescribed burning is typically used for fire hazard reduction and wildlife habitat improvement. Where if we think about the context of Indigenous burning that I described earlier, there's a lot of different reasons why California Indians and others use fire. And it comes from traditional law. It comes out of the objectives of why, when, how, and what we're burning, and even the right to burn. And being that California has no ratified treaties with tribes, California Indians never relinquished the right to burn. And so this is something that is an ancestral responsibility to steward within the landscape. And one thing I think that's really interesting to consider is that Indigenous fire is often multi-generational. So you're dealing with everybody from young children being involved in the application of fire within the landscape, to the elders within the community also guiding that process. And whereas like with prescribed burning and wildfire fighting, it's usually a certain age group of folks who are out there doing that work. So it's a lifelong learning process. When we think about what is the specific scale at which Indigenous burning takes place, Indigenous burning tends to be fine-grained. They're typically small fires that are lit, for specific vegetation communities within a landscape that is specifically targeted for burning. And we read the landscape, seeing where the fire needs to be applied, and we put the fire in knowing that it's going to be self-limiting within that landscape. Whereas wildfires typically happen without that self-limiting factor, and we see that they get quite large. With the Dixie Fire burning nearby to where I'm at, that's pushing closer to 1 million acres. That's affecting things at the bioregional scale, and no Indigenous fire would ever reach to that level. And in my mind, when I think about fires getting to that size, those are getting back to the idea of the first fire stories that I was talking about earlier. Indigenous burning in all the different ecosystems of California occurs throughout the year, whereas our wildfires tend to take place during the dry season. Indigenous burning is taking place when it's important to, when it's appropriate to attain the specific outcomes from that landscape. So each vegetation community type has a specific range of when fire should be used within it to achieve very specific outcomes. Maybe we're trying to produce more berries for quail, or maybe we're trying to increase more stems of willows to weave with baskets. And so each vegetation community has a very specific time frame of when it should burn, and then also how frequently it should burn in order to maintain certain characteristics. And you might be wondering, well, how do you do this? How is a fire self-limiting? And so I put this sketch together to kind of illustrate what that looks like. And if we think about different vegetation communities, from maybe oak woodlands and chaparral to a grassland ecosystem abutting next to a riparian ecosystem, if the grassland system is dry and it's starting to dry out, that's an indicator of the time of when we might want to put fire back into that place. And in the adjacent communities, the oak woodlands, for instance, those areas may still have a lot of moisture within them. They may not be receptive to carrying fire. And so we use fire in the grassland knowing that it's not going to spread into the oak woodlands, and we know that it's not going to spread into the riparian forest at that time of when we're burning. Knowing that requires knowing your landscape. Knowing that requires knowing your vegetation types, your soils. There's a whole variety of different things that we have to understand to be able to do that. But that knowledge is ingrained within our cultures. It's ingrained within our way that we work within that landscape. And each system then, as I said, has a specific range of when and how we burn. So I'm going to give some examples of work that I've done over the years throughout Central California region to kind of illustrate how and where fire is used and how it has changed those systems. So I'll begin by talking about oak woodlands. And I've done quite a bit of research in oak woodlands, ranging from valley oak forest to blue oak woodlands to black oak communities, and even within interior live oak and canyon live oak communities. And in this slide, what I'm showing are some examples of more of the deciduous oaks and burning that it's mostly focused. And all of these examples are specifically illustrating indigenous prescribed fire or cultural burning, and or indigenous informed burning, meaning that we're using the cultural indicators of when to burn within the landscape to achieve certain outcomes. What I'll say about the oak woodlands is that a lot of times, because so many of our oak woodlands are invaded by non-native grasses, the timing of when we're burning is really focused on trying to shift to native species dominance. So we're burning at a time of year during the cool season, when a lot of our cool season annuals begin to emerge, and they usually emerge a few weeks before our native species do. So typically late fall or even during into the winter, we burn in these places to reduce the non-native cover and to enhance native species. And through my research, what I've noticed is that our native species really favor fire. And if we're not burning frequently enough within the landscape, once we put fire into it, we have to have fire come back in maybe every 2 to 5 years to maintain the native species within that place. But the outcome is that we end up with species of plants that are supporting the native pollinators, and they're enhancing the habitat for different wildlife and so forth to be able to use these places. And so they're very rich. The next one that I want to highlight is another grass-dominated system, which are our foothill meadows and grasslands. And I think for East Bay lands, a lot of what I'm talking about here applies, particularly for the east areas of the park lands. And the foothill meadow type communities would be like your spring-fed meadows and so forth on the park lands. And here, we had places, and this is an example from the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, where I'm field director. And in this case, on the picture on the left-hand side, in 2012 or 2011, when we first brought fire into this meadow, this whole meadow was dominated by yellow star thistle, so an invasive plant. And we wanted to reduce the yellow star thistle. We wanted to enhance native species dominance, and also to improve the hydrology within the system. So we did a first entry burn, and we lit the fire, and the fire crept up underneath the oaks, and it went out on its own. We had no control lines on this burn. And since that time of that first fire in 2011, we've burned 3 consecutive times, most recently in winter of 2019. And you can see the blackened footprint of that fire from 2019 on the right. And again, no control lines on this fire. We're just burning, to the edges of the oaks, and then the grasses are basically the thing that's carrying the fire. What I'll say is that in the time frame of us burning, we've really shifted the species to more, or the landscape to have more native species, and we're starting to see that shift in hydrology. Next, I want to talk about the mixed conifer and redwood forest, and particularly I'm thinking about the opportunities that exist in some of the higher elevation areas within parklands, and even in the areas where the redwoods are at. And recently with the lightning complex of 2020, we saw the Big Basin State Park and the Santa Cruz complex burning through vast areas of redwoods. And one thing that I think is that if we're not actively stewarding for the redwoods and for the species within the redwoods, potentially, all of these vegetation communities will have fire as part of them at some point. Either we're putting it in or wildfire is going to happen. But I think the choice for us is really to put fire in on our own time so that we can help to steward them and make them more resilient to wildfires in the future. There's a variety of different reasons of some of the benefits, and I put in the middle picture of huckleberries responding from Big Basin State Park. And within the time frame of this picture, which was taken in April, I'm thinking, well, within the next 2 years, this is going to be a fantastic place to come in and pick huckleberries. And these are the kind of cultural indicators that we're looking for within these places, to be able to steward, to protect the redwoods, to protect the conifers, and then also have the species and the understory there to support those areas. Lastly, I'll next talk about the Chaparral and Montane Chaparral systems. And I guess I'll share this, that my first experience with burning in Chaparral happened to be on Mallory Ridge on East Bay Regional Park's land. In 2003, we went out with East Bay Regional Parks when I worked at U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and we burned with the park to enhance habitat for Alameda whipsnake. And there's a photograph there on the right-hand side showing what that fire looked like. It wasn't too impressive. The flowers on the manzanitas were in bloom. It was a really good, high fuel moisture time frame. So fire could be put in pretty safely without having to worry about it racing away. And that was a really good validation of cultural knowledge for me to see that fire and the way that it behaved, because traditionally when we know that landscape, we know the vegetation types and their moisture levels, we know that we can safely put fire in. So I was able to take that knowledge and apply it to the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve in spring of 2020. And we burned a small patch on a south-facing slope of manzanita to regenerate it and to create the mosaic that we were trying to enhance in that spot. Lastly, I'll talk about the riparian ecosystems, which is what I did my dissertation research on. And, riparian ecosystems in California are among some of the rarest ecosystems that we have. And a lot of times people think to exclude fire from those riparian ecosystems. And from a cultural perspective, fire is imperative to be within those systems. In order to have our basket weaving materials like willows and some of the other species that are found within the riparian forest, we have to be burning within them. And if we're not, then we're actually creating an opportunity where wildfires will spread through these areas. And oftentimes the riparian systems, which haven't been burned, are actually carrying fire into places that we don't want to burn. I know that there's a lot of consideration around smoke and concern around smoke. We've all experienced smoke over the last season. Many of us are probably still impacted by smoke, but there's also benefits to smoke. And from a cultural perspective, we use smoke for enhancing things like the fumigation of the canopy of the oaks to improve acorn production and minimize pests like weevils, and then also cooling our rivers and streams for salmonid production. And there's lots of other reasons, but those are some of the reasons why we might want to use fire. So in thinking about planning and thinking about the opportunities ahead for East Bay Regional Parks and where and how we might be able to bring fire back into the system, I just give an example of a burn that we did down at the Casumas River Preserve, which was a cultural burn. And what I show here is our burn planning and thinking about the wind direction and the smoke transport. And basically in this situation, and I'll highlight here, I don't know if you can see the cursor here, but the cursor is moving along Highway 99. So we've got Highway 99 kind of running on the west side of this burn unit. And we've got populated areas of Galt to the south. We've got Elk Grove to the north. And recognizing that, we were able to put fire in, knowing the direction of wind that we wanted to give us favorable conditions, but also the right kind of smoke disbursement to not impact those communities. So those are really important things to be able to think about. And then in terms of like planning out units, you know, everywhere that I work, I think about fire. I'm thinking about how fire moves through the landscape. I'm thinking about what opportunities there are to burn in different places. And this is just an example of current planning that I've got for the Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, where I've outlined here grasslands, oak woodlands, and chaparral communities in red, orange, and yellow, representing those different areas. And this represents about, I don't know, maybe 200-300 acres of area that we're planning to burn this coming season. But that same kind of thought process can be applied to other areas of the landscape. And so I'll come back to that area of Mallory Ridge. So here in white on this slide, we see this area of white. That's the area of about 20 acres that we burned or tried to burn in spring of 2020 on East Bay Regional Park's land. And converse to that is the area outlined in red, which is the Ohlone complex that took place last summer. And so I think, well, you know, if we're not using fire appropriately within the landscape, this whole system is going to change. We're going to have a change from the chaparral that's there. We're going to have a change in our grasses, and we're going to be losing a lot of the attributes of the places that we want to be stewarding. So the opportunity is really there for us to bring fire back into these landscapes. We've got nice, healthy communities in some of these eastern areas of the park lands, which I have shown in the photos on the right-hand side. But it's not just the remote areas of the park that need fire. I mean, here we can think back to the late, was it early 1991 with the tunnel fire, which is outlined in the photo on the left side. We see the turquoise color, that's the tunnel fire. And then there's a Brioni, I think there's a Brioni's fire in purple here from just a few years ago. So fire is part of this landscape, and we know that. And so even within the wildland urban interface, we need to be thinking about how and where to safely and effectively use fire. And knowing the knowledge of these systems, each ecosystem, the way that it behaves with fire, the way that it responds, and the opportunities and seasonal timing, this is where that integration of cultural knowledge can come into play around planning and thinking about how to make all of these communities, from not only the urbanized areas, but the wildlands themselves, to bridge to enhance the cultural healing that needs to take place within these landscapes as well. There's a lot of policy that's out there to help support that. And so, you know, I know that sometimes people are thinking about liability. Well, as I'm speaking, we've got pieces of legislation that are going to the governor's desk for signature to help to reduce the liability around prescribed burning and cultural burning. SB 332 happens to be one of those, and also AB 642. We've also got support from different federal and state policies around being able to burn. And recently, we came up with a report to look at the barriers to burning. And one of the barriers to burning happens to be access. And I bring this up because I think about the tribal communities of the East Bay and not having any federally recognized tribes within the East Bay. The real optimism that I have is that East Bay Regional Parks, as one of the largest landowners in the East Bay, has a lot of areas that are culturally significant, that are culturally important, and also places where people can reconnect to the landscape and help to steward those places, and share that responsibility and carry that responsibility forward. So with that, I'm going to bring it to a close. But if there are questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be online here to answer some questions as well. I just want to highlight in this picture, what we're looking at are poppies and lupins and native grasses that have come in from repeated burning. And this was a place that in 2007 was completely covered in yellow star thistle. And this photograph that I have here was taken this past spring. So many years of repeated burning have created this beautiful bloom of native wildflowers and native grasses that you see. With that, I'm going to stop the screen share, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor. At this point, I think I'd like to turn it over to members of the committee for questions or comments. Director Waspy?
Oh, okay. I was going to let Beverly go first, but thank you. Thank you, Professor. It's very, very interesting. Having been a firefighter for the East Bay Regional Park District for 30 years, I find this fascinating. Many points that, you know, we try really, really hard. And I think it's a little bit different in Butte County. I mean, I think, in my opinion, or what I've come to face is no matter what we want to do as far as control burns, the Bay Area Air Quality Management Board really, well, they put a lot of restrictions on it. It's very, very difficult to do that. I love the idea. I think it's a great idea. I wish we could do more burns. I hope we can do more burns. And if we can use, you know, cultural burns as a way of doing more of them, I'm all for that. The Park District has recently, though, really committed heavily as of last Tuesday when we spent, I think, over $1 million on equipment to cut down weeds, cut down brush, clear fire breaks, all mechanical. Would you, I have one question, then I'll finish up. But I mean, can mowing mimic fire? I mean, I know it can mechanically. Culturally, I would tend to bet that's probably, well, I'd like to hear your opinion on that. But I really think I'm excited by this. I've always been excited by control burns, and I think there's no question but I also think that those photos you have of great wild flowers coming back when burns occur, we know that. We're very much aware of that. We have constituents that if we saw that in a great meadow area or an oak woodlands area, they're right on our heels saying, yep, you're absolutely right. That's a beautiful way. Now cut down every one of those eucalyptus trees that are non-native and let's bring it all back to the way it was. I would be totally in favor of that. But I think that's one of our difficulties. And I think regulatorily it's very difficult. And also I'd be interested in, do you, if we do cultural burns, we include the Native American populations or just their knowledge and skills. I'm also aware that to do a control burn in the San Francisco Bay Area, unlike some of those, you know, Big Chico Creek, and I know there's houses around, but we literally have, I'm told, 77,000 fence line neighbors, to where well, we don't call them controlled burns, prescribed burns often can become great, incredible, especially where we live, liabilities. That's all conclusion, but thank you very much. It was fascinating.
Thank you, and excellent points. I appreciate your comments on that. One thing I'll start off with is the air quality side. Certainly, there is a vast change that's happening within the state around air quality. So Air Resources Board and the Air Regulators Association are currently working to revamp the way that they look at prescribed burning. In fact, last week I did a talk about, very similar to this talk, to inform the air regulators about this, and they're trying to find ways to support more cultural burning. It's a painful recognition, I think, for the state to realize that we're always going to have a bad smoke problem until we start using fire. And so recognizing that we have a choice of when and how we experience smoke is something that the air regulators are very well aware of. And I would personally be very happy to make those conversations happen with air regulators in the Bay Area to see the opportunities around burning take place. In terms of mechanical treatment is effective at reducing fuels, but it is not effective at obtaining the specific outcomes for the cultural characteristics of the landscape. It does not support the biodiversity to the same level. And so those are some of the factors that are at play. I'll say that in my early career working for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and this is where some of my knowledge of the East Bay Regional Parks lands comes in, is I was tasked with writing what was called the recovery plan for the East Bay species, which included the Alameda whipsnake and others. That plan never became finalized because I used the word fire too frequently, saying that we were going to burn in, the footprint of the tunnel fire, and we were going to burn in these places because we know that it's going to happen at some point. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And so for our communities, regardless of if it's, in a densely populated urban area or not, fire is going to be part of that system. And, you can minimize it with machines, but you're never going to get rid of that. And so we have to be using that knowledge to be able to apply it where and how we can. In terms of the cultural side of it, in terms of the, engagement with tribal communities, I'm currently leading an initiative that is statewide called the Intertribal Indigenous Stewardship Project. And that project, what we're trying to do is to build the capacity for tribal people to reconnect with the knowledge of stewarding the landscape. And I'm happy to say that we have participation from some of the local Ohlone tribal members who are working with me to relearn that knowledge within their place. The thing that's needed is the land to be able to do it on. Being able to work in the East Bay in particular is a great opportunity that's there. And I also know that there are people living in the East Bay, particularly in Berkeley and in the Berkeley Hills, that are trying to engage around this very topic. They're trying to bring fire into their neighborhoods. And I get emails about this stuff all the time. So I think that the community in general is receptive, but you have to start small. You have to start to show and build the trust around it. And you've got to start somewhere. It can't start with wildfire devastating us and then starting I think we really need to be proactive with it. So I appreciate those comments.
Thank you. And as a follow-up, boy, I like that tribes in the Bay Area are interested, simply because I remember at Coyote Hills, where we interpret and honor Native American culture probably more than any other park in our district. As a firefighter, I remember burning off those hills just about every year because they are way far away and you see a result. It's mostly grassland, but fennel was taking over the park. And I think we were able to eliminate most of that. So I think there's great opportunities in the park district.
Director Lane?
Yeah, thank you very much for this presentation. I know that you are getting a well-deserved reputation for somebody who can be articulate about what happened at one time in California and about how to address, how to involve the cultural community today. So I was very glad that you came today. We have, you're familiar with a lot of our challenges as a district, which focus on the prospect of prescribed burns possibly getting away and burning down buildings that have been placed right next to wildland areas, and getting permission to have prescribed burns, et cetera. So we do have a kind of a raft of challenges for that. And we definitely use grazing. I mean, as you know, 70,000 of our acres are grazed for several reasons. And when they are grazed correctly and ideally, you can end up with a whole native meadow because of the timing was just right. I still remember one of the supervisors, Roger Epperson, at I think it was Morgan Territory, who was delighted to be able to instruct how the grazers, when they pulled their cattle off. And as you recall, that was something that was added, I guess, maybe 20 years ago. And he really had them remove the cattle with an eye toward encouraging native plants and flowers. And he had people from CNPS come out one spring to see one of these meadows. And they said to him, "Oh, well, look at that. It's quite extraordinary, but of course you didn't graze." And he was delighted to say, "Oh, yes, we grazed for that purpose." And, but we're talking fire today. I really appreciate your story about yellow star thistle and eradicating it with fire. We have experimented with using fire and yellow star thistle, but perhaps not enough of the seasons to have it be as successful as your photograph showed. Anyway, I was very interested in your presentation. And but I do have a question for you. And that is, you're familiar with the Park District. And how would you suggest we could best go forward involving Native descendants in providing burns that also reflect their traditions?
Yeah, I think in terms of engagement with the tribal community and also just in general for planning, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. And I guess first I want to just say, in terms of the liability concerns, which you brought up earlier in your comments, one of the things that's really there around the Senate Bill 332, which is going to the governor's desk for signature, is that it's really working to address the liability. So currently, and Director Wasby can speak to this too. When we go out to burn, when we set fire, the one who sets the fire is the one who has the responsibility for it. We hold that liability. And so, personally, I never will take the risk of setting fire at the wrong time of year. And if we understand the statistics on escape prescribed burns, it's very low. When a prescribed fire escapes, typically the impact is less than an acre of extra area burnt, which may not be reassuring when you've just burnt down $1 million house or multi-million-dollar house. But the point of SB 332 is that it's putting in place the opportunity to protect people who are burners, to give the incentive to burn. So as a board, you would have more assurance around the opportunities around burning. Getting to your second point about how to engage the tribal community, I think that we've got good working relationships with folks, and Anna Marie, with her being on board now, I think we've got some good opportunities through discussions. We've had some great discussions over the last year with members of the tribal communities. Not all of them are going to be interested in this particular piece. Some of us have more of a sense of the traditional connections of the landscape and more of an interest and desire to do this kind of work. And I think that if we can sit down with those folks, we can sit down with the planning and stewardship folks, and we can sit down with the fire folks and get everybody to start visioning where we want to put fire and how we're going to use fire and those sorts of things. That would be a great starting point. And, obviously it's not just about fire, it's about stewardship and connection to land in general. But for me, fire is going to be a big part of that. And so if we can identify some of those places, which I've done, I've said, I want to burn some of those eastern parks, and I'm not going to name them off, but you saw pictures of some of them, and they're easy ground. There's roads within them. There's very safe places to start to burn, and you start to build that track record, and then you can bring it closer to the housing, in the more dense populated areas. So I see Anna Marie's popped back up. I'm assuming I'm running out of time, so I'm gonna wrap it up there.
Thank you. I just wanted to sort of tag in on the, tribal consultation part, and, just to add in that it would definitely, be done in a really mindful sort of way, with lots of planning and lots of conversation with the tribal groups that would like to participate, and hopefully with Dawn's help and guidance as well. So it wouldn't be something that we would, go into lightly at all, of course. I don't think anybody thinks that, but I think it would take like a lot of conversation between, the interested tribes and with our departments as well. And it would be an interdepartmental, effort between, planning and stewardship and operations. And it would be done in a really, meaningful consultation way with the local groups who would like to participate. So I just wanted to add that part in. And of course, with the, since there is an interest from the board, we would bring that up again, for discussion and,
Sure, we can pursue that. Professor, you started in response to Director Lane to address my concern. And that was when you suggested that you would be attentive to the timing of a burn, for instance, in terms of the risk of it getting away. We are all very familiar with the concept of prescribed burns, but they're always accompanied by control, by the effort made to make sure they don't run away. And so what I have to admit to being extraordinarily nervous about at this stage is the concept of relying on self-limiting burns without any control factors in place prior to initiating the burn, which you described as something you do and you oversee. That just frankly makes me really nervous. The whole state has the feel of a tinderbox these days, and certainly while I would appreciate being limited from the liability impacts, I would still be very nervous about such self-limiting design fires getting away within our parklands. And is it something I'm just going to have to study more in terms of what self-limiting is and how reliable it is?
What I'm throwing out there is that, when I'm talking about self-limiting fires is not necessarily that that's the approach that I would take right away on East Bay Parks land. But I'll say that why I share that with you is that I'm able to demonstrate it already. And as you were asking that question, I'm looking at the photo behind Beverly with the annual grasses. And, I'll give you an example. Like if I were to set fire in there, and assuming it's not a windy day, we go out there in the early morning and the relative humidity is high, we've got a lot of moisture in those grasses. So that kind of ridge behind her head, you see the grass down there in the low spot that's green. You see grass on the knolls around it. The hilltops themselves are browned out. That's where you could use the self-limiting fire. You could burn that dry grass while the humidity's high and not have it escape down into the green grass. The green grass is not going to be receptive to it, provided there's not a strong wind on it. And so that's just an illustration of kind of how it would be applied. But you've got enough trails, you've got enough roads within the park that you wouldn't need to solely rely on a self-limiting fire. And if you were not comfortable with it, you could construct line and those kind of things. I personally don't like to have to construct line because it's ground disturbing. It's a place where invasive species can move in, and it also impacts the cultural resources that are in the ground. And that's why I tend to favor more self-limiting and knowledge of the local landscape to burn within that. But it's not necessarily the starting point, and it really depends on where and if we decide to choose to burn in the first place.
Okay, that's helpful. Lastly, I'm curious about the scale that you're talking about. As an advocate, pretend that you were the czar of all land management and stewardship within our park system, and could wave a wand and have it done. I mean, what is the scale of burning, prescribed and otherwise, that you're talking about? It seems to me that when you're identifying the beneficial impacts of it, the beneficial impacts might apply to many tens of thousands of acres. if you were to do this to a scale that might be inviting to you as based on your understanding and studies of this. You know, how much burning are we talking about if you were in charge?
Yeah, well, I'm not familiar with the current land holdings within East Bay Regional Park's land, but
Sure.
I know that it's over 120,000, right? So, you know,
Yeah.
all of it, for the most part, is fire prone. All of it has a relationship to fire. That's not to say that all of it needs to be burned at once. Certainly that would be devastating. But when we think about the different vegetation communities, some of them should have fire on them very frequently, like the grassland areas in the oak woodlands. And some of them have fire on them less frequently, like the Chaparral communities. And so when we start to think about, you know, like within the footprint of the Ohlone complex, for instance, or they're above Los Vaqueros, it's burned recently. When should we think about putting fire back into it? You know, if we burn it every year, it's going to turn to grass. If we burn it every 100 years, then some of the species that we may want to see in that place may not have an opportunity to be there. In part, that's why we thought about, burning on Mallory Ridge in 2003 was to enhance a little patch of habitat for basking and foraging for the Alameda whipsnake. You know, it's that kind of knowledge that feeds into it. Ultimately, the plan is, I would say, you're having to look at fire as something on all those lands, but on an annual basis, maybe you're burning a few thousand acres every year and you're, picking and choosing. And maybe it's, 10,000 to 20,000 acres in one year. And then the next year it's only 1,000 acres. It just depends on what the seasonal conditions are and what needs to be burned in any given year.
All right, then that answers the question. It's potentially a massive scale, but over a prolonged period of time, it seems to me. And if we were to adopt a very wholesale approach that you're talking about, that's food for thought. Dennis?
Well, I was just going to say, and not only a large scale, but continual. I mean, if you do these things, if you the star thistle out in Briones, or pardon me, in Morgan Territory, you have to burn every single year and continue to do that for a certain amount of time. I don't know what it is. And, I love this. I think it's a great idea. I think using cultural burns, I think will strike a chord in the area we live. I think it might be what we need. And there's some legislation to this. I think it'll be great. But I really, I love this, and I think we can get some crews of firefighters that learn how to do this. If we can get this burn boss rule eliminated or relieved a little bit, I think it's a great opportunity. But I also think that my constituents, if we did a cultural burn in the middle of, well, let's say behind Beverly's shoulder there, they'd say, "What the heck are you doing? I want you to burn next to these houses, and I want you to do fire breaks," which I think we can do both of them. I think we can get really good at it. And Professor Hankins, for the park district's pretty good at this. We don't do lines. We burn lines in. We don't use mechanical lines and dig up the soil. We burn off our lines. It's very expensive, takes time, but if you're doing it near homes, it's a safety that we used to use all the time, and it's environmentally safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's actually one of the approaches that, traditionally people use around sensitive plant communities is black lining in around those. So, right on the edge of a sensitive plant community, you could come in, set a few feet of fire, and then put it out as you're talking about. Dr. Alvarez, I saw you raised your hand as well.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hankins. Director Coffey, with your concurrence, if I may. I just want to take a moment to put context in terms of the discussion that's taking place here and now. Interestingly enough, we are living what is being termed as a defining decade in the world to be able to address all those very harsh impacts from a changing climate. It happens that this week, or actually yesterday, the state of California is celebrating Biodiversity Day or Biodiversity Week. And the notion of having a conversation about the multiple benefits that can come about with not only managing vegetation fuels, but also bringing the additional benefit to have intended outcomes for the landscapes to know exactly how we want to manage the invasive species, to know exactly which types of vegetations we want to see come back to the landscapes that we're responsible for stewarding, plus bringing the people through the meaningful consultation with indigenous communities. It's just an amazing opportunity, and the discussion is timely. And I appreciate Dr. Hankins describing that we have an inflection point here. Climate change is here, and the urgency to do this work, to be able to address the unprecedented fires and the types of fires that we're seeing for the first time in the United States. They're being seen here in California, here in our backyard. So now there are conversations taking place by the decision makers on air quality. The fact that with a cultural fire or prescribed fire, you can control the particular matters that are being emitted into the air, as compared to a wildfire that you may have metal, plastic, asbestos, all kinds of things that can go into the air, black carbon, because it's burning communities. So I appreciate the leadership of Ana Marie Guerrero and Brian Holt, and certainly Christina Kelchner, to bring this conversation forward to the Natural Cultural Resources Committee. And I also wanted to let you know that these types of conversations have been taking place in prior years to continue the pioneering work of the East Regional Park District in managing vegetational fuel. Our fire chief, Eileen Tiley, has been in discussions on how to get a prescribed burn for all of for the entire district. And we're focusing primarily on the East land, since we do have our plan for the East Bay Hills. So this is the stars that are lining up. And I think that with the right legislation, with the right stakeholders and the right collaborators, we can continue to be pioneering, and we can bring about not only the educational component, but the being able to manage those landscapes and bring the communities with us. So I'm very excited to hear the conversation, Director Coffey, that is taking place here in this space. And I would like to continue the conversation with staff and board after Professor Hankins finishes his presentation. Thank you.
Okay, we'll do that. Coca or Sabrina, do we have any public comment, or are there any hands raised by anyone who wants to ask a question or comment? I don't see any.
We do not have any public comments for this item, but we do have one public attendee that we have not identified or spoken to. So here's your opportunity if you'd like to speak on this item.
Certainly staff or public can so indicate, raise a hand. Seeing none, Professor, yeah, this was very informative, very timely, and very important. So thank you for your time and being with us today. It's very much appreciated. And I would echo what Anna said about being appreciative of our staff that brought you here today and put this together. Thank you. Anything closing, Anna or Ana Marie?
I just wanted to thank Don again so much for his time. He's consulted and talked with a lot of our staff over the years, and we just really appreciate his input and his expertise on both biological and cultural issues.
And I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it. I mean, you all are holding lands that are central to who I am, who my community is, and it's a responsibility to future generations. And I just appreciate the opportunity to advance that conversation here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Coffey and Dr. Hankins. Director Coffey and Dr. Hankins. We'll continue the conversation offline, and we'll keep you informed, because I think it's a continuation of a lot of work here that we can certainly bring back to you.
Okay, so if it's all right with my colleagues and management, can we move on to our next agenda item? All right.
Yeah, thanks, Director Coffey. This is Matt Grawl, Chief of Stewardship And I am going to introduce the next item, but I did, just with the comments on my limited time, I just do want to kind of thank Professor Hankins for the talk today. And Stewardship's also very excited about this. I know with the format of the meeting today and comments, we didn't have a lot of direct interaction on this, but we've been thinking a lot about these same things, but also learned a lot from your presentation. And so I'm really excited about the opportunity to work together and identify the best sites for where we get the best benefit from implementing this. Because our staff's really been thinking about opportunities for prescribed fire to enhance the ecology, and it was just a very informative presentation. So thank you. But again, Matt Grawl, Chief of Stewardship, and I'm here to now introduce an item with the Coastal Conservancy. And so I'm very excited to introduce this presentation, and we just really greatly value our relationship with the Coastal Conservancy. I know many of you are aware of the various grants we received the Conservancy, but today really want to talk about some projects where we're directly working with them on the ground to implement habitat restoration projects. And both of these topics Moira is going to be updating you on today are things that have been to the committee in the past with full presentations on each topic. But I thought it was a bit timely to give an update on the Living Shoreline project at Giant Marsh. Now with the climate change we're seeing and the predictions of sea level rise and things happening, it's very important to start looking at possible techniques that we can use, nature-based solutions to make our marshes and shorelines more resilient to sea level rise and protect the habitats in those areas. And so we were very lucky several years ago when the Coastal Conservancy did an evaluation of the best sites to implement and to expand some techniques that have been used at other sites around the bay. And when they did that analysis, they really determined that the Giant Marsh site was the best candidate to look at the option of expanding these techniques and using them on a larger scale. And so that work happened several years ago, but we're still in the monitoring phase, and there's other additional phases of the work that have not been completed yet. And so we're working to gather the funding and get those ready to implement the second and third phases of the work. But there's some really meaningful observations that have happened over the last years of the offshore treatments. And then we've also been a long-term partner with the Invasive Spartina project. And we've been, very actively working to help manage the non-native Spartina. But the district has also, for many years, been concerned about that implementation. So we've been very engaged and working to make sure as it moves forward, it's being implemented in a phased approach so we can protect the species that are currently exist in the marsh habitats. And so just really happy to have Moira here today and the Conservancy. I really value that partnership. And we're doing, like I said, some very exciting work to protect and maintain many of our shoreline areas. So with that, I'll just kick it off to Moira. And Moira has a presentation to really give you some more specific updates on these projects.
Great, thank you so much, Matt, for that introduction. And thank you, Chair Coffey and directors for inviting the Coastal Conservancy to come and share today. So moving on to the Baylens and Submerged lands, I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. And like Dr. Hankins, I'm gonna stop my video to try to keep my internet connection as stable as possible. So here we go. Okay, can folks see my screen now? Great, okay. So, right, I'm gonna give a brief update today on the Invasive Spartina Eradication Project and the Giant Marsh Living Shoreline Project at Point Pinole. And just a shout out to my colleague, Marilyn Lata, who's been managing both of these projects and is on a well-deserved vacation today. So I'm sort of pinch hitting for her. Okay, so native Pacific cordgrass, or Spartina foliosa, is the primary low marsh plant in the San Francisco Bay wetlands, and it's a critical part of the natural ecosystem. It's located at the low marsh edge, and it provides habitat and cover for endangered species. It provides food resources and shoreline protection. But there's 4 species of invasive Spartina that have been introduced to the bay since the 1970s. And this is a big problem because invasive Spartina causes a number of environmental, economic, and human health impacts. For example, it degrades habitat and reduces biodiversity by outcompeting native marsh and adjacent transition zone plants. It hybridizes with the native Pacific cordgrass and could ultimately result in the extinction of Pacific cordgrass. It dominates the mudflats. The hybrid Spartina spreads rapidly across open mudflats, and it creates meadows of cordgrass where once there was a foraging for migratory birds. It reduces flood control. The dense stands also trap and rapidly accrete sediment, and it can quickly fill in slough channels and stormwater drainages and cause flooding in adjacent fields, homes, and businesses. It increases mosquitoes. The dense hybrid patches also cause conditions in the marsh that promote increased breeding of mosquitoes, which could spread diseases such as West Nile virus. And it causes failed restorations. So guided by the Baylens Habitat Goals project, most restoration projects are working together towards the overall vision of contributing to a diverse and complex array of natural habitat features, mudflats and complex tidal channels, large areas of mid and upper tidal marsh, and salt pan features that support native and migratory wildlife, birds, fishes, insects, and invertebrates. But the uniform monoculture meadow formed by invasive Spartina species does not allow this array of features to form, and it invades and eliminates many of the features where they do exist. I think this is just a really important point to underscore, given Dr. Alvarez just mentioned Biodiversity Week. So that brings us to the Invasive Spartina Treatment Program. This is a bay-wide project. The area covers 70,000 acres. Annual treatment of invasive Spartina occurs each year from June to November. Treatment is accomplished by careful application of the herbicide imazapyr, which is approved by state and federal agencies for use in wetlands. Accessing the marshes to carry out the treatment can be difficult and requires careful planning via foot, boats, airboats, and trucks. And so therefore we depend on our strong coordination with bay-wide partners such as the district, as new restoration sites are opened up, that we can carefully coordinate to limit the spread of the invasive Spartina. So what's been the progress to date? This graph takes us through 2019, but as of 2020, there's only about 33 remaining acres of the non-native Spartina that have been mapped. So this means that Spartina acreage has been reduced 96% estuary-wide. Initial successful control began in 2005. So this is an ongoing project that's had a lot of investment over the years. And it reduced the invasives dramatically in the initial years of the project. It's getting a little bit trickier now because the remaining patches of invasive Spartina are sort of scattered throughout the marshes. So it's more difficult to identify and get to them. So once the sites are clean of the hybrid, the other main project activity is to revegetate them with Pacific cordgrass, the native. The program has propagated and outplanted 500,000 seedlings to date, including at several district sites such as the MLK Shoreline and Hayward Regional Shoreline. And this winter, we will install another 25,000 seedlings and integrate plantings with the giant marsh living shoreline site, which I'll get to a little bit more in a minute. So again, we work with a local native plant nursery, the Watershed Nursery, to propagate plants in raised beds and containers. And so we amplify a small amount of material collected from donor marshes in the bay and then grow it in the nursery in these raised beds and large containers, depending on the species. Here's some pictures at Eden Landing, where the district partners with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, as well as the Conservancy. The planting locations are shown in green on the map, and the paired pictures show the native Spartina plots that have grown in dense cover over time at 3 of the photo point locations. You can see A, B, and C, and then the corresponding progress at those sites with the revegetation. And this drone image shows the many acres of native cordgrass habitat that is now expanded at Eden Landing site since 2016. And it now supports breeding California ridgeways rails. And here's a few pictures of successful cordgrass and marsh gum plant plantings to the north at Cogswell Marsh, Hard Marsh, and Oraloma. And the new plant structure provides key habitat as well as shoreline protection by slowing the wave energy and limiting erosion. We're also constructing small 250 square foot habitat features known as high tide refuge islands to provide cover at extreme high tides for rails, mice, and other species. Several islands have been constructed at Cogswell Marsh and are performing well and growing in height as the plantings mature. So we're integrating the Spartina plantings with oyster reef and eelgrass restoration and a living shorelines approach to minimize coastal erosion, because again, these features attenuate wave energy. They help maintain coastal processes and provide natural habitat for plants, fish, and wildlife, and people. For many sites, this requires new methods and design approaches that haven't been tried before. So we're using proven techniques that we've learned through the Spartina revegetation, and it's providing an opportunity to better connect the less studied underwater nearshore habitat like shellfish reefs and eelgrass beds as sort of a linked gradient with the other adjacent habitats up the slope. So living shorelines is part of this complete marsh concept that's recommended in the Baylens goals and the adaptation atlas, really connecting habitat types in one synergistic multi-benefit project versus a bunch of single habitat approaches. So now on to the specific giant marsh living shoreline project. So this is the first living shoreline project in San Francisco Bay that connects the submerged underwater habitat with the adjacent wetlands and upland ecotone plant communities that we just talked about. Design was completed in fall of 2016, and it includes different habitat treatments. It includes oyster reef and eelgrass plantings, seaweed, specifically Pacific rockweed, and tidal marsh, and upland ecotone components. And the oyster reefs are paired with the different vegetation types, the eelgrass, the Pacific rockweed, the Pacific cordgrass, and they're also sited at different tidal heights and shoreline orientations, and they use different reef types and materials. Some of the plantings, including California endangered sea blight, were installed in 2019. And then the Pacific cordgrass and upland ecotone plantings are planned for this upcoming winter. So it's been really important to develop collaborative partnerships to implement this work. One agency cannot do it alone, and the work requires an interdisciplinary approach to designs that integrate biology and engineering. These types of teams require extra resources and time in the beginning to set sort of a shared baseline understanding across sectors. For example, most coastal engineers don't know the life history of the native oyster, and most field biologists are not familiar with engineering risk equations and plan specs. But the projects end up being more successful and also more connected to the community because the mix of university researchers, graduate students, consulting firms, nonprofits, marine contractors, all working with local, state, and federal agencies to innovate and achieve a common goal. So one thing we're learning is the need to increase the number of trained contractors and also the local availability of appropriate marine equipment for shallow water. Although many contractors don't have experience with activities like reef restoration, they have vast years of experience working in bay conditions and are willing to experiment and innovate. We recently worked with a company from Washington State because they had shallow water barges and lightweight modular cranes that were needed for these conditions. And then we're also working with the permit agencies. We received special permission to ground at low tide, allowing us to complete the treatments within a 2 to 3 day windows, which had much less impact than making repeated trips for weeks in and out of the site during portions of each short tide cycle. And San Francisco State University led the eelgrass plantings by boat. So because subtidal restoration work in general and living shorelines in particular is at its early stages in our estuary, it's critical to carefully monitor the species response and the ecosystem functions and services that are gained from the project. We don't have published data or even gray literature on these topics. So this project was designed with heavy monitoring to provide some of the first data on benefits and success. This includes frequent sampling events, often at extreme low tides, and a lot of coordination between groups so that we don't have conflicts between activities. So on the seagrass side, San Francisco State University researcher Kathy Boyer and her team have planted and monitored eelgrass in the offshore reef and are seeing healthy survival rates of more than 50 to 60% and expansion from the planted pots. And there was concern about negative impacts on the plantings from 2 heat waves that occurred during low tide events in the summer of 2019. But the summer and fall 2020 and summer 2021 monitoring shows that the plantings are actually doing well, with survivorship in 88 out of the 99 plots. And 1 plot of eelgrass did have to be replanted this summer due to the heat wave effects. There are high numbers of crabs, including red rock, Pacific rock, graceful, and Dungeness crabs that use the eelgrass. And so in this photo, you can see the top left, these are the reef balls here in gray. Here's a side scan sonar image of the Oyster Reef. It's difficult, to get out and monitor because it's hard to see, it's hard to get out there. So folks are experimenting with different ways to do the monitoring. Down here shows a drone image. And on the oyster side, the Smithsonian Institute researchers are leading the oyster group. And they also had concerns about the low oyster recruitment observations in fall of 2019. But in summer and fall of 2020, they saw substantial numbers. On the offshore reef balls, they recorded an average of 520 oysters per square meter. On the higher elevation nearshore reefs, oysters are present at all elevations, and there's higher densities at mean lower low water and below. Pacific rockweed plantings haven't had good survival, and additional plantings are planned for 2021 in higher densities to prevent heat desiccation. The picture in the top middle shows a surviving Pacific rockweed transplant that's providing cover for newly settled Olympia oysters. So overall, the oysters are doing well. The low estimate was 400,000 at the site, but the July 2021 preliminary data indicates that there's at least 1 million or more. So finally, what's up next? As I mentioned a few slides ago, native cordgrass and upland ecotone plantings are planned for this winter. We've waited until the invasive Spartina is sufficiently controlled at the site. And after many years of careful treatment, the total footprint is down to less than 10 square feet. And there's going to be additional treatment occurring this summer. Olafson Environmental is leading the planting design and will incorporate best practices from the extensive revegetation that's been implemented as part of the Invasive Spartina project. And the Coastal Conservancy has moved forward with growing the plants at the nursery in preparation for these plantings. So that concludes my update. Thank you very much. And I will stop sharing and turn it back over to Matt.
So Matt, do you have anything to add, or should we turn it over to the committee for questions or comments?
No, I don't have anything else to add. I just want to thank Moira again for the presentation and the update. And I think we're enthusiastic about the additional plantings and the transitional zone plantings, the ability to expand that habitat at Giant Marsh. I think that'll be a great benefit to that site to add that additional plant diversity. So looking forward to that next phase. But happy to answer any questions about this overall project. And I do think that after the director's comments, I think there are a few public comments.
All right. Directors, Director Lane.
So Giant Marsh is part of the Dotson Family Marsh, right?
Yes, well, it's adjacent to, and so there, and it's all. And now I'd say now that the Dotson Marsh has been restored, it's one system. But before, the Giant Marsh has been in place, and many parts of Dotson Marsh weren't necessarily marshlands before the restoration happened. But after the restoration happened, it is considered more of a marsh complex.
Okay, and so where is it exactly? Is it closer to Point Pinole?
Yes.
Further?
Yeah, it's that northern end north of Dodson Marsh that's immediately adjacent to Point Pinole. I mean, it's all part of Point Pinole now, but yes, it's the area north of the Dodson Marsh. It's connected in that whole marsh system there.
So we've been working on this project for many, many years, I think.
Well, yeah, we've been doing a lot of work in the Giant Marsh for many years, the Park District. I mean, but it's been more as far as maintenance and cleanup. You know, there's a lot of debris and ice plant and other things. And so we've been removing a lot of the creosote logs, and so we've had various grants. And then Dave Rinchie's done some plantings of marsh gum plant and other plants not related to this restoration over the years. So we've been doing that and replacing ice plant with native marsh habitat for a number of years. But this is more like centered on the offshore areas and areas, and then on the shoreline edges to really provide those areas with more resiliency.
So are we getting funds from other people to work on this?
Yeah, the Giant Marsh restoration, I mean, in that demonstration, the Living Shorelines project, I believe that it was all primarily, well, the Coastal Conservancy, there are many of they had many grant funders and partners and to fund this work. I'm not sure if Moira has the full list, but I think the total cost of that work was about $3 million for this, because there was a very detailed site selection process that happened before that looked at all sites around the bay to identify good candidate sites for this work. And then they went into the design and permitting of this work. And then the physical implementation and the construction of the reefs and all that work was about $1.5 million, the physical construction of the reef structures and the placement of that out onto the subtidal areas. And Moira, do you have any more details on the funders?
Yeah, so some of the funding that went into sort of the previous Living Shorelines work, and then, you know, the design of this specific site came from U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service grants, a couple of those. NIFWIF grants, there was some EPA funds and some funds from the State Wildlife Conservation Board. Those were kind of the main ones.
And so our staff is spending quite a bit of time on it as well, or it's part of many other projects?
So it's part of many other projects. I mean, our staff is somewhat involved, but really the implementation has really happened from the coastal. So it's more of a coordination with the Park District staff and making sure, you know, staff is aware when certain projects come in. We help them get an encroachment permit to be able to go out and do the work, and are involved in the long-term monitoring and just oversight of and making sure that nothing, you know, happens to those areas and the overall protection. But the partners that San Francisco State and the Coastal Conservancy have consultants who are doing a lot of the detailed monitoring. So we look at the monitoring reports and help with the implementation of the work. But our staff hasn't, I mean, it's really been mostly consultants and using the grant funding to do the work. Our staff's been more involved in an advisory role.
Okay, so are you happy with it, Matt?
Oh, very happy. And I'm very excited about this next phase. I mean, because I think we'd always wanted to do all of this. So I think that's where, and we are, you know, we have identified some funding within the stewardship budget to help support this work. And we're looking to, you know, acquire additional funding to help with additional planting. So, but yes, we're very excited about it. And one, it's something we've wanted to do in many, I mean, we've done similar things in other areas. I know they talked about some of the high tide refugia islands that have gone into some of our other marshes. This is, I mean, these are, like I said, these are different techniques, but this work will provide similar benefits to some of those projects. So it's just exciting to use new techniques and also other things that can help increase the overall biodiversity of this site. And I mean, the oyster reefs have already colonized numerous oysters. I mean, they're just, the number of oysters that are already colonizing those and the bird activity they're seeing is just really phenomenal. So I know they're collecting a lot of that data. And as we have more monitoring on the birds and things that are, and the specific numbers and the species that are all using those oyster reefs, it'll be very interesting once we get full summaries of that information.
And if I could just add on to that, I think what's really exciting about this is that, you know, we have been charged for a long time to think, you know, more in a systems way. And then, you know, that gradient from submerged up to upland. And this is really, I think, you know, the first projects that's actually going to do it. And, you know, once, you know, these planned plantings are done this winter, you know, that will sort of complete that suite of activities. So it really is innovative work and it's very exciting.
Okay, good, thank you.
Director Waspy?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I'm very happy we're taking care of this problem. I do wonder, so is the herbicide, imazapyr, how is that listed? Is that, we're always taught it's warning, caution, danger, or danger, caution, warning, or whatever it is. Where does that fit in the mix there? Or how is it classified?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Director Waspy. I think the best person to answer this is Drew Kerr. Drew's on the line. Drew's with Olson Associates, and they've coordinated that treatment. And Drew, do you want to answer that real quickly? And may Drew introduce yourself to the group.
Sure. Hi. Thank you for the question, Director Waspy. My name is Drew Kerr. I'm the treatment program manager for the Invasive Spartina project, working with Olson Environmental. Yes, the imazapyr is rated at the lowest level of toxicity. So it's a caution is the signal word. You're referring to the signal words. Caution is the lowest. Warning is the next one up, in danger above that. Toxicity to even down to the benthic invertebrates in the sediment is very low, that's why it's a favored herbicide for use in habitat restoration and in work in these sensitive estuarine systems. It's labeled for use in the estuaries by this California Department of Pesticide Regulation. And it's been providing excellent control of the Spartina while yielding no negative direct benefits that we're aware of. Also, our water quality monitoring over the years for the water board compliance with the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System shows a decrease of about 90% over the 1 week period post application. So sometimes upwards to 100%. So it's known to be in the literature to be very short-lived in the estuarine environment, broken down by sunlight.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. The follow-up would be, because I'm known to be against herbicides of all kinds, but I understand what we're trying to accomplish here. And so is there any data from, say, Alameda County mosquito abatement control because I assume if this is a breeding ground for mosquitoes, that they would come in and use probably stronger chemicals to kill mosquitoes or larvae. So is there any data that show that they don't have to do as much work when we eliminate this breeding habitat for them? Or is it just anecdotal?
Director Waspy, I'm not sure about the answer to that question.
I think that's more over a longer time frame. So by reducing the infestation of the non-native Spartina, as Moira showed in her slides, we have a huge drop in those initial years from very, very high, hundreds of acres, 800 acres, down to these lower numbers. So we were stopping that problem from being created, that pooling, that ponding that would create that problem where they would have to come in and do more repeated maintenance. So we were getting ahead of that and then maintaining that as we try to approach eradication in general. So the answer is, I think, no to your direct question, that we don't have that kind of comparable data. That said, I'm not in the mosquito abatement field, so we'd have to consult with them about that. But that's kind of the general gist of that habitat creation by the non-native Spartina.
All right, thank you. And then finally, so when the non-native Spartina is removed, it's always replaced with another type that's native or some type of vegetation, right? In all cases, I mean, in every treatment area, it's always replaced by something else.
Actually, that's a great question, and it's a very important nuance to this project. And an explicit goal of the Spartina project is to restore and protect our mudflats, which are supposed to, as Moira mentioned in her presentation, be unvegetated, to provide essential foraging habitat for shorebirds, both our resident shorebirds and the millions of migratory shorebirds that move through on the Pacific coast. So in many areas, we are wanting to have unvegetated mudflats, and so we are protecting those and restoring those. Then in other areas where the infestation was very dense, we're extirpated, as we say, the native cordgrass, restoring, once the non-native cordgrass is brought down to a low level, then we can go in and replant, as Moira's slide showed. Eden Landing is a great example of that. We can go in and replant in other areas like Don Edwards National Wildlife Refuge, where we got in and controlled the infestation or maintained it at very low levels as we approach eradication. There is no need to reintroduce the native Spartina, because it's so prevalent there already. So it varies a lot is the short answer to your question. Sometimes reintroduction is necessary to jumpstart the ecosystem. Sometimes just getting rid of the bad one and allowing the good one to flourish is enough. And sometimes we want mudflats, unvegetated state, returning to the natural state of unvegetated mudflats.
All right.
And so
thank you very much.
They were talking about, Director Wasserman, the work they were talking about there at the Giant Marsh. Now we've gotten close enough to the eradication of the non-native enough now that we have the ability to plant. So in this area, we're also planting a little bit more than we would in other sites, because we're doing it right on the edge of the shoreline to also try to improve the resiliency of that.
Exactly.
Plant to then protect the shoreline. So, but we're only able to do that now that we've eradicated the non-native enough that we're able to get it. Because if we didn't and left the non-native there, they would then hybridize again, and it would create the same problem we've been trying to attack for the last several decades. So.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Moira, could you tell me what a ecotone is? Not familiar.
Yeah. So basically, it's a transition zone, and it's getting to that concept of, from the submerged to the intertidal to the upland areas. And there's different kinds of plants that are specific to those sort of edge zones.
In the slide that had a yellow line out that depicted the ecotone, which caught my attention, it included the Giant Road parking area for Point Pinole. Is that
I think
true?
it was more of just like the general project area in which, all the activities were taking place.
Okay, that's good. Final question for me was, I was curious of the construction of the reefs. What is the material? It looked like some form of concrete formation that was used to create the oyster reefs.
Yeah, well, there's baycrete, which is like there's mixes of sort of mud and silt and other kinds of substrates, and I think that's sort of part of the Living Shoreline's various pilot projects. There's it's been tested, and they're also in sort of different shapes. Like sometimes they're balls, and other ones they've been called sort of layer cakes. And folks are sort of just testing, which mixes, which sort of configurations, and then also adding in, the eelgrass. Sometimes it's sandwiched in between. Sometimes they're side by side, and it's really sort of testing which configurations work the best. And I guess I'll also say too that one of the big problems is the weight. Like it's hard to get out there, physically and install these things and deal with them. And so I think that when thinking of the materials, the weight is also a consideration, and folks at San Francisco State, et cetera, are sort of constantly thinking about that and trying to innovate.
I just think it's really cool that we're participating in the creation of reefs. I was familiar with the oyster construction out of Point Pinole. You can see it from around the pier area out of Point Pinole. But I wasn't aware we were recreating reefs. That's
and that was a separate project. That was an early precursor to this that went out at the pier. That was done by I want to say Save the Bay, but it wasn't Save the Bay, but it was the Watershed. Sorry, the Watershed project. So they did an early thing of using those bags and creating the reefs near the pier, which was just looking at like how would they work to help colonize oysters and improve that habitat. This is taking that same application and applying it in a way to look at reducing erosion, and then doing it in a more iterative way, as Moira was describing, of various, trying to see what configuration of blocks, bags, or oyster, the bags of the oysters mixed with eelgrass, and in various configurations to see what's going to create the most benefit or the best habitat or the best, where does eelgrass establish the best. So, after we get some more of the results over this, we'll get a better idea of, in the next project, we may just take 2 of those techniques and apply those over a larger area, or find out what works best. So that's what's so, I think, I didn't say that earlier, but that's, I think, what I'm most excited about is using this as a testing ground for these various techniques. And then we can apply it at other places like Hayward or Albany Beach or other sites around the bay.
Well, that's fantastic. All right, so any follow-up from the committee members? So otherwise, Sabrina, do we have any requests for public comment?
Yes, we have Susan Mullany is here. You can unmute and.
Susan.
Susan?
Hi, I have been doing habitat restoration in the Bay Area for 8 years, including shorelines along the bay. And I believe that opportunities to restore landscape that we collectively as humans have damaged are rare. And so I fully support these restoration projects with the goal of bringing back and supporting wildlife. And these projects are often slow and measured as they should be. And this final stretch of the Spartina project, I think, needs to slow down because it's harming the critically endangered Ridgeway rail. The rail used to inhabit much of the West Coast, and now it only lives in the Bay Area. And according to some research I've been doing, for example, in the Biological Invasions Journal, it says that the rails have decreased in number by 50% since this project started. And they mentioned, the presenter mentioned that they're planting gum plant, Grindelia, to help support the rail. But according to bird watchers from Sequoia Audubon, the rails don't use the Grindelia. And in the 2020 report from the Spartina project, they said that the increase in rails in some of their survey areas is due to relocation of rails out of the areas that have been treated for the Spartina. So I understand it's a balancing act. You know, you're creating mudflats for some birds by removing habitat for others. And in this case, I really think you should err on protecting the Ridgeway rail. So I know there's 5% of the Spartina remains. But I do think that not enough Spartina or other plants have been planted. Something else I read said that they started in 2005 removing the Spartina, but revegetation didn't start until 2012. So again, it's 50% of these birds have been lost due to the Spartina removal. And I think something replacing habitat needs to take place before the final push of the Spartina is removed, because these rails have somewhere to go. So thank you, that's my comment.
Susan, are you doing restoration on your own, or are you associated with an organization?
I volunteer with Golden Gate Audubon at Pier 94 and within Golden Gate Park. So Pier 94 is also going to be hosting some of the Olympia oyster restoration, and I have volunteered once with that project, and I think that's great. I think they're also going to start planting the grass. I can't remember the seaweed grass that they mentioned, but that's also going to take place at Pier 94. So it's shoreline is something, you know, I care about the shoreline, and I think we've lost 90% of what there used to be as far as being the most important stop on the Pacific Flyway for migratory birds. So I'm on board with removing non-natives and making the coastline more stable for sea level rise.
Okay, well, thank you for your volunteer work and joining our meeting today and your comments. Matt or anyone want to respond briefly?
Yeah, thanks, Director Coffey. I guess a couple things. I'm not sure about that statistic on the 50%. I don't think that's accurate. And on the decline, and maybe at some localized sites, there were some the large decline. But many of these sites, the Park District had some of those concerns with, had the same concerns with the rail decline when treatment was happening full bore in all sites and just trying to eradicate as fast as possible. And the Fish and Wildlife Service also had those same concerns with some of the treatment. So there was a biological opinion that was issued that basically put restrictions on many of these sites and stopped treatment in the most sensitive areas of a half of Arrowhead Marsh. There's also 3 other sites at the MLK Regional Shoreline Complex that aren't allowed for treatment right now. And then several other sites were initially restricted, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service put a requirement that there had to be an 80 rail increase bay-wide within the range of the species before they would even consider going into treatment in those areas. And so back in 2017, we did hit that 80 rail increase in the overall population. And the service then felt we could go into some of these sites and do phased treatment, very slow phased treatment. But many sites are still restricted and will continue to be restricted for the next 2 years under the current biological opinion. And so that biological opinion expires in 2022. And so then the service, and over the next year and a half or so, the service will be looking at, during 2022, the service will be looking at it again for the 23 treatment program. So we're looking at the overall rail populations and looking at how do we address those areas where rails still are at risk. And so we're looking at that. And I guess the other thing I'd say is that the gum plant was not the only thing that was done to create habitat for rails. In many areas, we've created more small islands and high tide refugia mounds that are all planted with gum plant and other marsh species. And so we are doing other techniques. And I guess some of this maybe could have been started sooner, but I think there's a lot of restoration happening activities now as far as creating this additional habitat and then very carefully moving forward with treatments in those areas. But many of the, like I said, most sensitive areas of rails right now are still in a restricted state by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, so we're not allowed to treat in some of those areas. So Moira, did you want to add anything?
So I'll just add one more thing. And thank you, Susan Malani, for your comments and for your volunteering. We really do appreciate that. As far as the concern about the lag time between the eradication and then the revegetation, as I understand it, there has to be several seasons of monitoring after the eradication to make sure that the site is clean enough to actually start the revegetation. As was mentioned previously, to do it too soon, unfortunately, just brings back that risk of more hybrid forming, and then it's basically starting over. So just really making sure. And I think that and I think Drew probably knows more about this, but the way that the invasive Spartina works, that sometimes it can reappear based on sort of like if we've had a dry year or a wet year or something. And so you may think it's gone, but then, sort of the conditions might change the next year and then it's actually not gone. And you just have to be sure by doing the monitoring throughout a series of wet and dry years. And so I am not an expert on that. I'm sure Drew could elaborate, but that's my understanding of why there may have been that lag, because folks were just trying to make sure the site was clean enough before going in to do that the replanting.
Okay, thank you. Drew's just nodding, so we're okay. Any other public comment or staff comment on this agenda item? All right, seeing none, was our recording supposed to stop? I guess not. That was the answer. So, Sabrina, do we have any public comments on items not on our agenda this afternoon?
No, that concludes public comment. There are no further public comments at this time.
All right, folks, so we're near the end. Remaining is board comments. So I'll ask Director Waski.
Thank you to staff and everybody. This was incredibly interesting today. Great topics, great questions. It's amazing the things we do in the Park District. Thank you.
Director Lane?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I thought this was really very interesting again today, and good topics for us, and a very interesting combination, you know, because I'm always wanting cultural resources items, and we had a combination, which was fire and cultural. So that was interesting. Again, I did want to say thank you for the IPM report for 2020, you know, that I received. And are we going to have a report on this report, or we're just all reading it? Where are we in terms of sharing the information in that report?
So Chief of Stewardship and Matt wrote. So Director Lane, there's been a bit of lag in getting that out, and we did present that back in the April meeting.
Right.
So that report was the final written report from the presentation that was made by Pamela and Becky back at the 2 meetings ago. So yeah, so that was there was some challenges with getting everything printed and everything formatted in the right format this year, and so that's why there was a delay in getting the report done.
Okay, and then as I think I sent you an email on it, I think we need to have acknowledgements included in there as who did the work and the writing.
Yeah, and thanks for that comment. I did see that. I haven't been able to double check on that. We usually do have some of that, and so, but I think we've also at times been hesitant about naming individual staff members versus groups and how all that gets done. So, but I'll talk to public affairs about that formatting.
Yeah, so that would be helpful. And then I would like at some point us to have a report on the health of the Martinez shoreline. You know, I don't believe we've talked much about that for a while. And I go there from time to time, and I don't really have a sense of how well it's all doing. So if we could have something along that line sometime this year, I would really appreciate it.
Okay. I want to conclude by again thanking Moira for attending and presenting. Very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.
Also want to thank Sabrina and Coca for all the effort to make sure we're doing this correctly and do it well. And appreciate that, and all the staff work, and they were very interesting and good topics today. So it was a very good meeting. I would add, Matt, that at some point we were maintaining a list of potential future agenda topics for this committee, and I have lost track of it. And it would help me think through where we are and where we should be going if we could recirculate such a list and add Director Lane's topic on the Martinez shoreline to it.
Okay. Thank you. And also I'll work with Sabrina to add Director Lane's topic, and then we can recirculate that. There were a couple topics that were proposed for this time that weren't timely, or we had some challenges with staff getting them ready. So those can be kind of pushed into a later time. The next meeting, where we have one meeting left in December, and we already have several topics slated for that. So we'll have to talk about how we manage that, and which get pushed into next year. And so we'll recirculate the list, and then we'll meet with you to talk more about the ideas for the agenda for the next meeting, and how do we fit it all in? Because I think I think we have about 4 or 5 potential topics at this point, and then we also. Just as a reminder, now that I'm saying all that and thinking about the reason we don't have a meeting for a couple months is we have our Stewardship Seminar, which is planned for November the 3rd. And so that'll be a virtual Stewardship Seminar this year again. And last year we did over 2 days, but once we looked at the topics and things this year, we felt like we could do it over one day. So we'll have it'll be 1 day seminar on the 3rd. And it'll be about a 2.5, 3 hour session in the morning, and then about an hour break for lunch, and another 2.5, 3 hour session in the afternoon. And so that will sort of take the place of one meeting happening over the next 2 months, but then we'll be back again in early December.
Terrific. I'm looking forward to that. Always joy. So with that, Dennis?
Nope.
I thought maybe you were raising your hand. So with no other board comment or management comments, I think we stand adjourned. Correct?